Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The 11th round of talks between Modi government and protesting farmers ended today without a resolution as was expected. And this after Modi government has gone so far back as to even offer that they will suspend the implementation of these laws by a year and a half while farmers and the ministers talk and iron out the problems that are there. Farmers have rejected that. They want nothing else but a total repeal. In fact, they have shifted the goalposts. They now say total repeal and also a legal guarantee for minimum support price. So that is where we stand. How do we describe this situation? This is, you can call it a cop-out, you can call it a surrender, you can call it mission abandoned, you can call it a tactical retreat, or government getting cold feet, or maybe an inconvenient stalemate for the government. You can choose your expression, something strong or maybe a euphemism. But the fact is that what actually is a very good reform, I mean, I will acknowledge it, I have written it, I have said it, and I will say it again and underline it. These three farm laws mean no harm to the farmers. They will, if anything, bring enormous benefit to the farmers. Now, farmers, particularly farmers of Punjab and Haryana and Western UP, do not see it like that. If they do not see it like that, then that becomes also a fact that you have to deal with. You cannot bash on unmindful of that fact. India has come to a stage where reform can no longer be carried out by stealth, as might have been done between 1991 and 2014. Because all the low-hanging fruit in this reform or economic orchard has already been plucked. Now you have to do stuff in public. You have to climb on a tree, if I may use that metaphor, and be fully visible and justify to people what you are doing. That is what this Modi government's move towards farm reform has failed to do. Because you can't suddenly go to the farmers of Punjab and Haryana, particularly. These are the green revolution states, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP. These are surplus producing farmers. They are not hand to mouth farmers. In farming terms, they are relatively prosperous. They are not as rich as the city folk, but compared to farmers elsewhere in the country, generally they are relatively more prosperous. So they believe that how their farming has been has worked for them. Now, you cannot tell them suddenly by passing three laws that the system of farming that made two generations of you richer, better off, producing surplus and getting encomiums from the rest of the country, that is now over. You have to move on to something new. This is too abrupt and you can't persuade them just by plonking three laws onto them. That is where this resistance is coming from. Now we look at reasons why we think and where we think Modi government went wrong, and we list 7 of them, and I will read these out for you. Number 1, some of these we discussed in an earlier national interest, specifically on Punjab. Number 1, for Modi-Shah BJP, it is impossible to accept that in north of India, there is a non-Muslim state. There is a state with, if at all, a marginal, tiny population of Muslims. That does not take Modi's word as law. That does not fully follow Modi as, say, people in UP or Bihar or Gujarat or even Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh might do. Because the BJP's way of looking at the world politically is in terms of Hindu-Muslim, and they see Sikhs also as a kind of Hindus. It is because of this that the second reason comes. The second reason is that because they think that Sikhs are also Hindus and they will also be as amenable to Modi's persuasion, just a message from Modi, as the rest of the Hindus, that they did not particularly see the need for allies in Punjab. They should have known that even with allies, they did not do well in Punjab in 2014 and 19, even when Narendra Modi was on the ticket, not in assembly elections. But they were arrogant, and at that point, contemptuous of their ally, which is Akali Dal, they let them go. If they had kept the Akali Dal with them, and through the Akali Dal carried out a process of persuasion, they might not have been in this mess. Today, you are in a situation where the BJP government does not have any party in Punjab promoting or selling the reforms to the people of Punjab. Congress would not do it because Congress is in power and doesn't like the BJP, obviously. Aam Aadmi Party is in fact taking advantage of this situation and playing on the grievances. Why not? This is politics. And the BJP doesn't count for very much in Punjab, and even the BJP leaders who are there are today hiding, cowering in fear. The one party that could have spoken for them, the Akalis, which has a large Sikh vote, especially the Jat Sikh vote, they have now turned hostile. So it's a very strange thing that when these ordinances were passed, Akalis were part of the NDA and her Simrat Kaur Badal was a member of the cabinet. When the laws were produced, she left because she saw resistance in Punjab. If you had done some homework before that, if the central government had done more homework, persuasion, carried out more popular contact before that, maybe they would not have lost the Akali Dal and they would have had an ally and somebody to speak for them in the state. Then, big mistake the BJP makes is in thinking that what are the Sikhs? They are not Muslims, right? They are not Muslims, they are closer up to Hindus. They are also Hindus following a different sartorial style. That is not true. And it is very complicated because Sikhs in Punjab or Sikhs in general are Hindus, but they are not Hindus. Because if they were to be Hindus, then the Gurus would not have founded a separate religion. So they are very close to the Hindus. They have close relationship with the Hindus. They have ties of marriage. They have shared second names. All that is there, but they are not Hindus. They are a different religion. They might even get the benefit of Hindu undivided family, but they are still not Hindus. So you cannot drive them with the slogans of Hindutva politics. That doesn't work for them, and also they don't quite have the same insecurities about Muslims as you might be able to sort of stoke in Uttar Pradesh or Rajasthan or Madhya Pradesh or Gujarat, because they went through a very rough partition. There was a lot of violence and killing, but they feel more self-confident in terms of their being able to manage the challenge that is thrown at them, if at all, by Muslims. So they are not insecure. So that option is not available to you. The next thing the BJP government failed to understand is Punjab's tradition, the Sikh tradition. The Gurdwara is an institution where for hundreds of years now, organizing the community, organizing a community meal, getting everybody together, organizing a big campaign is a part of life. No other faith in India knows how to do it. No other community in India knows how well they can do it. And the next mistake that the BJP made, that is in not understanding the left influence in Punjab. Because if you look at Punjab now, you will say over 30 years, nobody from the left parties wins in Punjab. So what's the big deal? But if you had cared to get your inputs, you would have known that from very early 20th century, in fact, since before Sardar Bhagat Singh, Punjab has had a very deep left influence. And what happens is, you have the organizational skills of and the institutional community skills and tradition of the Sikhs, and then you have the political skills and articulation of the left. Together, it becomes a formidable combination. That is what Modi government is now facing, the unity of the Sikhs and the skills of the left. It's a very strong combination, and I don't see the ministers that Modi government is putting forward to negotiate with these people can match these. Number 5, because you think that anybody who's not a Muslim or a Christian, anybody who's a Hindu in your worldview will believe Mr. Modi anyway. So you saw no need for persuasion, whereas in politics, persuasion is needed. You have to create public opinion. You have to sell an idea to people. You have to market an idea to people, particularly if it's reformist and if it's changing people's way of life. So from this, we come to the sixth, because the six are the way they are. Some of the brahmastras that you use against others are not available to you. So number one, what are these brahmastras? Force is not available to you, as you might use it against Muslims, which we saw during the anti-CAA agitations. Number two, the agencies. You can say NIA, you can throw ED, you can throw CBDT. The six won't bother. Also, these agencies increasingly have lost credibility now. And also, in Punjab today, nobody will see any action by these agencies as really genuine. It will be seen as political, so it doesn't work. And the third weapon that's not available to you is patriotic propaganda. That is to say, you are anti-national or you are in cahoots with foreign powers. Unfortunately, some BJP people have tried doing that, first on social media. Now the odd BJP MP or somebody, or sometimes a junior minister, stands up and says this, and each time this is said, this actually gets the protesting farmers' backs up, because nobody buys any of this nonsense. This is seen as nonsense per se, dead on arrival. And seventh, and that is the point on which we will talk in a little more detail, the seventh is that the Modi-Shah BJP has a contempt for history, contempt for not Mughal history or earlier history, contempt for contemporary history. So the history as they understand from the RSS and the Shekhars is that Nehru made many mistakes. So they will count all of Nehru's mistakes. But they also admire Indira Gandhi in some ways. But they also forget that Indira Gandhi also made one mistake, big mistake, and suffered a defeat because of that mistake. Not an electoral defeat, but a philosophical defeat. Because if they had known that, then they would have known the limitations of what they are doing right now with farm laws and what they needed to do to prepare the ground for bringing in these farm laws instead of using their usual shock and awe tactics. So we take you back to 1973. 1973 was the peak of Indira Gandhi's, Mrs. Gandhi's power, popularity. She had just liberated Bangladesh, nationalized the banks, Garibi Hatao was the slogan, Green Revolution had come in, India had become self-sufficient in food grain. But 1973 was also a time when India's economy had begun to suffer. Why? Because one, it was suffering from the ravages of the war, because a war is a very costly thing. So anytime people become enthusiastic about war, they have to know that after every war, the price is paid by your economy. So there was a post-war economy. Second, that was the time when India had begun to also face the ravages of Mrs. Gandhi's nutty socialism. I would have preferred to use a stronger word because it was worse than nutty. Because I'm not even convinced that she had faith in that socialism. That was populist socialism. Nationalize this, nationalize that, fix the price of everything. So even the prices of cars were fixed. And as T.N. Nayanan, the editorial chairman of Business Standard, wrote in a 2014 article, it was all done with Mili Bhagat, sab mile hue the. So the car that was the cheapest was the Fiat car of Premier Padmini. Why? Because the bureaucrats preferred that car. So bureaucrats fixed the price, so they fixed that price at the lowest level. Then bureaucrats also controlled how much a company could produce. So Premier could only produce a certain number of cars. Because of that, there was a long queue waiting list for those cars. The bureaucrats for themselves actually also built a quota for those cars. So they got those cars early at a low controlled price. And then in 3 years, they could sell those cars in the second-hand market, and there was such a long waiting list for those cars that the price of a second-hand car after 3 years, because that was not controlled by the government, it was actually higher than a new car. So any bureaucrat could then sell a car after 3 years, buy a new car with that money, and also be left with some money in his pocket. Why? Because the bureaucrats, the Sarkar-e-Hind, the state was doing all this. At that peak, that is when prices had started going up in India, because you can't control the price of everything. There is a logic of the markets. As things happened, 1973, the Yom Kippur War took place, and so the Arab countries got together to cartelize and to bring up and to jack up the price of oil. When that happened, inflation in India went to intolerable levels. And there's an article that I quote from by Srinath Raghavan, who was a fine contemporary historian, in a collection called Builders of Modern India, edited by Ramchandra Guha, who reminds us that at that point, India's inflation went up to 33%. 33%. Today it's about 3%. So imagine, it was 33%, and Mrs. Gandhi was hurting. And she was then persuaded by her left ideologues around her to nationalize grain trade, because she was told, you fix the price of everything, but now get private sector out of grain trade. Government will directly procure everything and then sell it in the market, so you have complete control over prices, as it is done in the Soviet Union. And she decided to go ahead and do it. Once again, she jumped without checking the parachute, which is precisely what the Modi government has done now. And when she did that, what happened? The farmers were unhappy because their market had been taken away from them. The people in the market, that is the aartis and the traders, were unhappy because their avocation had been taken away. Consumer was unhappy because this led to hoarding, and this led to shortages and prices going even higher and higher and higher. In fact, at that point, to tell you a story, her planning commission was headed by D.P. Dhar, who was one of these pakka leftists in her cabal, in her socialist cabal. The only one who protested against this change was noted economist from Punjab University, then PhD from Stanford University, and at that point, among the most prominent economists in India, B.S. Minhas or Bagicha Singh Minhas, graduate of Khalsa College in Amritsar. So Bagicha Singh Minhas, when he said that this was a mistake, then the Planning Commission Deputy Chairman of the Chief Commissar in Indira Gandhi's cabal said that you are soft on rich farmers. And Bagicha Singh Minhas said to him, you are soft in the head. This also is a story that Nayanan had quoted in that article. But at that point, nobody listened to him. But when things went wrong and Mrs. Gandhi realized that she had made a wrong move out of sheer arrogance and because of the lack of groundwork, that she withdrew this decision. It was the only major decision she ever took that she withdrew. So this was a lesson. Now I know the contradictions in the situation. She was taking the markets away from the farmers, and the farmers were angry. Now Narendra Modi is trying to bring more markets to the farmers, and farmers are angry. So there is no contradiction here. These are just contrary situations because the philosophies of the two are contrary. Indira Gandhi was driven by her extra pink socialist philosophy at that point. Narendra Modi at this point is trying in his second term to have a reformist philosophy. This, to my mind, was the most important reformist step that Modi too has taken so far. But both decisions in implementation have suffered from the same flaws, which is lack of groundwork, lack of understanding of what you are doing, and lack of understanding of limitations of power. So Mrs. Gandhi may not have understood the limitations of 350 plus that she had at that point, just as Narendra Modi has not understood now the limitations of 303 that he has now in Lok Sabha. Now all rulers, no matter how powerful and how popular, have their limitations. Even in classical dictatorship, say in China, Xi Jinping will have some limitations. In Russia, Putin will have some limitations at some point. In democracies, this is much more complex. So the most popular leaders in democracies have their limitations. These can be political, these can be geographic, these can be ethnic, linguistic, religious, anything. Particularly in a diverse democracy like India. Now, a large number of people in India just accepted demonetization because they said, okay, Narendra Modi is making an honest mistake. He is entitled to make an honest mistake. But similarly, a lot of people in Punjab and Haryana and Western UP are not willing to accept these farm laws just because they are being thrust down their throats. Also, different ethnicities have different character, different temperaments. So that is where persuasion or nudge is required. Now, it's not as if Narendra Modi doesn't know the art of the nudge. In fact, it's his government that's been talking about nudge economics, which I would rather redefine as nudge political economy. So look at the way the Give It Up campaign was carried out on LPG, it worked. Look at the way Swachh Bharat campaign, Build Toilets campaign was carried out. Not perfect, we are not in a perfect world, but it worked. How come in this case no such effort was made? And this when he already had the lesson of the Land Acquisition Act having gone wrong. Because what happens is that when you are dealing with farmers, you are dealing with a very large number of people. Then at any point of time, you might say, oh, but a lot of farmers agree with me or they are not protesting, but yet the number of farmers who are protesting can always have a critical mass, so you cannot ignore them. So that is why government has held 11 rounds of talks with these farmers. They held no rounds of talks with any Muslim protester on CAA. That is something which I am surprised that Modi at this point did not pay attention to. So in conclusion, I think this also comes from the fact that Narendra Modi's PMO, his own politics, his inner councils now, they don't have people who can give him the bad news or who can do like a contrary check or who can play the other side. Like the armed forces, when they plan a battle, they always make somebody the other side who acts like the adversary. So that is not being done. That's why there is no background information, there is no understanding of history, there is no understanding of ethnicity, peculiarities of a region. Otherwise, we would not have ended up in this situation, because you know, politics can be all about winning elections. If it works for you, that's fine. You can't fight with it. You can't fight with somebody who's winning on how he is winning, how and why he's winning. But governance is not about winning elections. Governance needs both. Winning elections needs Chanakya Niti. Governing needs Chanakya Niti, that is strategy, plus Ram Rajya. That is the ability to listen to others, to reason with them, to persuade them, and where necessary, do a little give and take. So remember, Chanakya Niti wins you elections, can win you elections, but Chanakya Niti plus Ram Rajya is needed to govern a country like India, and that too when you are trying to bring about such a big change. Because if you were to understand that, then you would not make blunders like calling these protesters Khalistanis, etc., or throwing the NIA at them, because they are not bothered. At the same time, no one else is convinced of this. So in conclusion, it is from this lack of patience, understanding, and the limitations of personal popularity in Punjab that we face this disaster, this looming disaster on farm laws now. This also explains the first 6 points out of the 7 that we listed today. In fact, this deserves to be, I think, the high reformist point of Modi's second term after a messed up economy in the first. But as we all know, what is economics in a democracy if not politics by another name?